Now, our skipper Mike is steering the boat. And we're on Browning's Pool in Little Venice. The area is named after the English poet Robert Browning. He had lived for many years in Venice, and when he returned to England he settled just around here in this area. This small island on your right, Browning's Island, this is where he would have written a lot of his poetry. That's now a sanctuary for wild birds. And we're on the Grand Union Canal, which opened in 1801. All the canals were built over 200 years ago. And they were built purely for commercial purposes, for transporting goods around the country. No proper roads or railways back then. Canals were the liquid highways. The Grand Union comes down from Birmingham in the Midlands, terminates at this bridge where we'll join the Regent's Canal. And the path all along here on your left, the tow path. Our horses would have walked along here in the old days, pulling the boats along in the days before engines. And the house just here on your left is the tollkeeper's house. In the old days you would have had to pay a fee here to use the canal. That's now a privately owned home, as are most of the toll houses now along the canals. The Regent's was one of the later canals to be opened. It was built between 1812 and 1820 and was financed by the Prince Regent. This canal goes across London, goes on down to the River Thames. Today we're just taking you as far as Camden. All along here in Little Venice is a private mooring, and we go quite slowly through the moorings as people live on all these boats along here. These are their homes. If we go at any speed we can disturb or even damage the boats. You have to pay to stay on the private moorings. In London that's around £7,000 a year. And you also have to have your boat licensed for it to be on the canals. It's further £500 a year. But with the private moorings, when you take your boat out, nobody else can take your mooring space. Now we use fresh water on the boats. It's kept in a tank. We use bottled gas. Our heating is mainly coal and wood burners or diesel heating. And we can generate electricity through the engine. On the private moorings like these ones, you can plug into the main supply. You'll see junction boxes along between like every other set of boats. The boat you're on today, Jason, is over 100 years old. It was built in 1906 as a workboat. And most of the boats you see today are made of steel and are welded, but Jason is made of wood and iron and is riveted together. When this was a workboat, the area that you're sitting in, this is where the cargo would have been held, and the family would live in very cramped conditions in a cabin at the back. It was only around 6 foot by 10 foot. Also extremely basic, no sanitation, just a simple coal burner for their cooking and heating. There were no engines in the boats back then. All the boats were pulled by horse. The horse would walk along the towpath, as I said here on the left. The horse would be walking about 20 yards ahead of the boat and was harnessed by ropes. Just ahead of us is the Maida Hill Tunnel. This tunnel doesn't have a towpath. So here they would have untied the horse at the foot of the hill, to walk up away from the canal, across the road there at the top, it's the Edgware Road going across there, and then down the other side where it'd wait for the boat to come through. Now, without an engine, the only way they could get the boat through the tunnel would be to use manpower. So here they would place a plank of wood across the front of the boat, and then with a person lying either side, they'd put their feet against the walls of the tunnel, and then pushing against the walls, they would walk the boat through. Now this was called legging. And this tunnel is just over 270 yards long. And when we go through here with the engine, it just takes us a few minutes. But if you had to leg it through this tunnel, it would take around an hour. And there are tunnels along the canals without a towpath that can be up to 2 miles long. So you could just imagine having to leg it through one of those. It's also fairly narrow, this tunnel. There's only room for one boat to pass here at a time. Well, there's nothing at the other end, so we're going straight on through this morning. Now, as they came out of the tunnel here, they would re-harness and the boat would continue back under 1 horsepower. Now, this short bridge tunnel we're coming to, this does have a towpath, and so the horse would continue to pull the boat through here. Just as we enter under this bridge, if you look to your left, on the very edge of the tunnel wall, it's just directly beneath the yellow no cycling sign there on the left, you'll see groove marks dug into the wall. These were caused by the ropes dragging against the wall as the boat was being pulled through. I see these marks would get quite deep. That's many, many years of the old horses pulling the boats along. Also, thick, heavy ropes back then, made from cotton and silk. Nylon hadn't yet been invented. You'll see the rope marks again as we exit the tunnel, again on the bottom left, very edge of the door. into Liffide. There's a boat just coming towards us here, Gardenia, the London water bus. I was telling you before how a family lived on the boats in the old days. And as this boat passes us, if you look at their cabin area at the back their crew are standing, it would have been about half of that space a family would have had to live in back in the old days. Now on your left is the power station. Now this was used when coal was burnt to provide London with electricity. We no longer burn coal. Now a substation. It was purpose built here on the canal. Remember, no railways back then. All the coal would come along canals from the north of England and from Wales. Now our boat is 72 foot or 21 metres long. If we need to turn around when we're going along the canals, we need to find a turning point. There's one just here on the left. Big gap here between the boats. Known as a winding hole. Before engines, wind would help to turn the boats around. Now this again is a private mooring with people living on all these boats. It wouldn't have been like this in the old days. Back then these boats would have just been in the way. Back then this was a very busy commercial area with all the boats in and out of the power station. Now the walls over here to your left is where the tunnels used to run into the power station. You can see there where they've been bricked over. Now all the coal would be dropped here and taken through, and then the boats would come away with all the ashes from the burnt coals. These would then be sold on and were used to make bricks. And they also had stables along here where they could stable up to 200 horses, which would be hired out to work with boats. In the 1920s, when they started to put engines in boats, they gradually stopped using the horses. And with all the motor cars and the railways, that everything obviously can be transported a lot quicker by road and rail. And it was around the end of the Second World War that canals were going into commercial decline. But up till then, just about everything and anything would go around the country on the boats, like all the coals and the bricks, ashes, iron ore, all sorts of building materials. In fact, most materials used for building roads and railways would have come along the canals. Also all the clothing materials, all sorts of food. It was quite usual for the entire family to live and work the boats. There was no education back then for boat children. Never really in one place for any great length of time. And most children would be working by the time they reached school age. Now we speed up again as we leave Liston Wide and the moored boats. At this stretch of canal along here, this was one of the original homes of Lord's Cricket Ground. The ground had to be moved, or twice in fact, when the canal was being built. And all the earth that was dug up from here then went to make the new and permanent ground there then at St John's Wood. We're coming up towards Regent's Park. And the park was designed in the late 18th century by John Nash. And he was a leading architect and town planner. You may have seen examples of his architecture in houses back there at Little Venice. And Nash also had to decide where the canal was going to be built. Now, originally, he'd planned the canal to go right through the middle of the park, but local residents objected, and so it was decided to build along the edge. And we'll be travelling all along the north side of Regent's Park. As we come through here on your left, this is the start of Grove House Gardens. The Grove House itself is just round this slight bend here. It's the white coloured house that is up your left, set back behind all those trees there. On your right are the mansion houses. John Nash designed these houses in the early 19th century. They weren't built back then. All these mansion houses are quite new. They have all been built just within the last 20 years. All the mansion houses are privately owned. They cost upwards of £30 million each, and that is for leasehold, and you can't buy the land. All of the mansion houses are built on royal land. This is all the outer circle of Regent's Park here on the right, which is all owned by the Crown. We're still with Grove House Gardens here on the left. These are one of the largest privately owned gardens in London. If you're familiar with the willow pattern, you know, the blue and white willow pattern that you find on crockery, that's how these gardens here have been landscaped. All the red brick up there to your left, that's nothing to do with gardens. They're all apartments, St John's Wood area. Now, just coming under the Tyburn Bridge, this has a river beneath it, River Tyburn. It's one of London's, or many lost rivers. It flows through a pipeline, comes across from Hampstead, which is on the left, then it goes out all around the park, and then it's back into the pipeline on down to the River Thames. It used to flow down by the Tyburn Gallows there at Marble Arch. up towards Macclesfield Bridge, it's known as Blow-Up Bridge because it was destroyed back in 1874. Two boats that were carrying gunpowder accidentally exploded beneath it. It was a massive explosion, could be heard throughout Camden. And they rebuilt the bridge using the original iron columns that support it. And as we pass under the bridge, if you look at the columns on the left, you can again see rope marks dug into the ironwork. But just before we go under the bridge, if you look at the last tree on your left, you'll see it still bears the scar from the explosion. Just a very young tree at the time, but it managed to survive and it continued growing. And as we pass it, you'll see it has a large crack running right through. We'll continue now along the north side of the park. Now this is a lovely, peaceful part of London. You can quite easily forget along here that you're right in the middle of a major and very busy city. Just a couple of minutes walk there over to the left, you'll be back out in all the crowded streets again. We do get a lot of wild birds and geese along here. There's also lots of freshwater fish. Get a lot of carp and pike along here. And we have over 4,000 miles of man-made inland waterway throughout the country. They were all built by navigation engineers, or navvies as they were known. And they didn't have any machinery back then. They dug everything just using shovels and pickaxes. It's extraordinary when you think about it, because all the canals, all those thousands of miles, seem to all come along over quite a short space of time. And the canal isn't terribly deep. They do vary slightly from place to place. Where we are here, this is around 7 foot or 2 metres deep. But even then it does get a lot shallower there along by the towpath. All the water comes in from the rivers and streams and reservoirs. The canal won't flood, but they do freeze over in cold winters. Now we're just at London Zoo. Now we don't stop here at the zoo. I know there are quite a few of you visiting there today. I'll show you shortly which way to go if you are walking back there today. It just takes around 10 minutes to walk back from Camden. The zoo is one of the oldest in the world. Opened in 1828 as a private zoo, and then in 1847 it opened up to the public. It's changed enormously over the years. Today, as well as to hundreds of species, it's also used now as an education and research centre. On your left, the Snowdon Aviary. Now the aviary is part of the zoo, but it was built much later on. Opened in 1963. It was designed by Lord Snowdon. At that time he was brother-in-law to our Queen. Caused a huge fuss at the time. It was thought the design was far too modern for London. It's now one of our best known landmarks. The Zoological Society of London are based here at the zoo, and they do a great deal of work, not just here, throughout the world, working with endangered species and in conservation. I mentioned earlier about the commercial decline of our canals. Back then, a lot of canals were filled in, as some were actually built over, so now those canals lost forever. A lot of other canals were just left to run dry, but over more recent years, a lot of the canals have been opened up again, and that you can go really anywhere in the country along the canals, or will branch off one to the other. Canals kept alive today really by the thousands of people living on their boats, and then there's all the leisure. You get many people hiring out boats for holidays, and you get hotel boats and restaurant boats, or the trip boats like ours. We also have a floating classroom. It's an electric barge that comes up and down here during the week. Take the children out on their school lessons. And we have slowed again as we come up to the Cumberland Basin. And there is actually a speed limit along the canals, which is 40. When you walk back along the these moorings along here on the left, these are Camden visitor moorings. You'll find visitor moorings along canals throughout the country. Now, provided your boat is licensed, you can stay on the visitor moorings free of charge. And they do have a limited length of stay. This one here, this is 7 days. Now, if you were to stay on after that, then you would just pay to daily rate. Anyone that was hiring out boats for holidays, it would be the visitor moorings that you'd be staying on. And also a great many people living on their boats will be constantly moving around, going from one visitor mooring to another. To get a place on the private moorings like the ones we already passed through this morning, it's very hard to come by. But having said that, many people living on boats like to just be constantly cruising around, going from one place to the other. You see some lovely houses all along here on the right. And today's houses like this alongside of the canal, very expensive and actually very sought after. It's sort of like the trendy place to live these days. It wasn't always that way. In the old days, it really was just the poorest people that would have lived in houses like these alongside of the canal.